Well, thanks for having me. I've been fortunate enough over many years to travel around the world, and I've deliberately taken myself to look at some of the environmental problems in the world to see what I could learn and messages that I could pass on to other people. And today I just want to report on a few of those for you. So, environmental management messages from the world. So just as a lead-in, there are a few things that are of concern, I'm sure, to all of us. The emerging world, there was a guy a number of years ago called Thomas Friedman wrote a book called Hot, Flat and Crowded, and what he was saying was we are getting some climate shifts which are going to create some environmental problems and hopefully solve a few as well. The world is flat in that technologies move around the world, and I think also he was talking about rising middle classes, increasing consumption, which is putting the world's resources under even more pressure. And of course the world is crowded. We're getting increase in population, particularly in Africa, but in a lot of parts of the world where the environment is already under extreme pressure. And so the conventional wisdom is that we're heading for over 9 billion people by 2050, and we've got to work how we can get a sustainable growth during that sort of period. And I'm trying today to stimulate you to think about travelling to learn, because it is a wonderful way of seeing what others don't see, a wonderful way of benchmarking against other countries, other people, what they've done, the good and the bad, and can really help you sit outside your own country and your own business and look back and say, yes, this is what I need to do to move ahead in a good way. And when I say the boiling frog problem, one of the problems of our society, as I see it, is that two of the major drivers of our society and decision making in our society tend to be short term, and so our democracy, because of the short term of government cycles, tends to be short term. It's hard to get a lot of vision into democracy, and our capitalist system rewards short term gain and discounts longer term gain. Therefore, we've really got to fight to deal with some of these longer term issues. And it's one of the reasons I love family businesses, because families tend to take a longer view. And I've got 2 little grandchildren at the moment who may well be alive at the turn of the century. And our family is thinking very actively about how we as a family can take a long-term view to relationships, to our businesses, and the things we do in order to help mitigate some of the potential problems that could occur during this century and even beyond. So the boiling frog issue, supposedly, I've never tried it, is if you put a frog in some water in a saucepan on a stove and you slowly raise the temperature, I'm told the frog never hops out until it's cooked. And I'm afraid a lot of human beings are just looking out the window each day, not seeing any significant change, and yet all the time we're edging towards some significant problems, and we better be smarter than the frog and deal with the problems before they become too serious. So what I wanted to do today was just give you some personal snapshots, that's all they are, from some recent travel. I wanted to focus on 5 issues: water, soil, air pollution, radiation, because I've had some recent experience, and a little bit on renewable energy. So it'll be all pretty quick, but hopefully some ideas that might stimulate your thinking about what you can do in your own businesses and how we can get our decision makers to head off some of these potential problems. So let's see what we can learn. So number 1 is water, and it is, as I travel around the world, often in arid countries, but in highly populated countries, this one is significant already and is bound to get worse. And yet we know we can't exist without water. It's not only water quantity, it's water quality as well. And so I pop up this bit of a table. You don't have to read all of it, but you can see the population of the world where they're over pumping the aquifers that they control in their countries. And it's pretty scary. We're talking about 3.5 billion people in the world that are living in countries where already the aquifers are over pumped. And you can see, say, a country like Saudi Arabia there. We're dealing in alphabetical order here just to find it there. They tried to grow wheat using underground aquifers that were finite, and they've had to give up growing wheat. They have to turn, with their enormous wealth from oil, to desalination to provide water for their people and their cities. I think it's something like 70% of the water in the main cities is desalinated water these days. Very energy consuming, and you've got to be pretty desperate to go in that direction. But a number of countries are doing that. And the United States, down towards the bottom, overpumping aquifers, and we're already seeing some of the problems resulting from that. So that chart alone, and that's 2010, is pretty scary in itself to see what a dire situation we already are in with water in the world. And if we bring it to the here and now, this year in California, about 800,000 acres of cropland will be left fallow because there is not enough water to irrigate. Agriculture is such a big user of water. It tends to use about 70% of the water that's used. But of course, if there's a competition between urban and agriculture, urban will pretty well always win because that's where the votes are and that's where the immediate pressure is. And so we're seeing that playing out here and now in California in the United States. And I'll show you a couple of slides in a minute, but one of the areas I went to try and do some learning was Uzbekistan. The drying up of the Aral Sea, which some of you may have seen on television, is put down as the greatest environmental disaster of the 20th century. And it involved cutting off 2 huge rivers to grow cotton under the Soviet era. And it's resulted in of course, the Aral Sea drying up, which was a huge fishing resource for countries around the Aral Sea, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and indeed to the Soviet Union when it was the Soviet Union. And on top of that, the chemicals from the cotton have all ended down in the bottom where the seabed now is, and there have been horrible deformities amongst children and health problems and so on. And so I went there to try and see what I could learn from that. And I've been to China many times, and the pressure there, particularly in the north, there's more water in the south of China than there is in the north. The pressure on water quality is significant as well, and they're even digging 3 1,300-kilometre canals to take water from the Yangtze River in the south up to the Yellow River in the north. Desperate stuff to try and get their water quantity and quality in some sort of shape. And in India, which has a rapidly growing population, and I think probably already exceeds China or will in population, we've had a green revolution which was based a lot on new wells and pumping and new water use. It is very hard to see that might be repeated again. We just be hopeful that water use can be a little bit more efficient and we can use new technologies to get somewhere with that. So let's look at some pictures that tell us a little bit about some of that. This is a fairly detailed map, but those of you who are interested in geography, we're in Central Asia. We've got Uzbekistan, we've got Kazakhstan to the north, and you can see Tajikistan down in the bottom right-hand corner, Afghanistan to the south, and we're over towards Iran, over to the west in this. You can see the 2 rivers, the Sudaria at the top and the Amudarya down the bottom. The Sudaria starts in the Fergana Valley, which is a lovely valley with vegetables and a lot of intensive agriculture. And the Aral Sea, as we'll see in a minute, used to be huge as you can see in this map, it's split into two little bits, and there's a town of Munyak. You may not be able to see it, but it is just south of the Aral Sea there. That used to be a major fishing town and fish processing town. It's now 100 kilometres from where the water was. So you can imagine the effect of course, the fishing industry disappeared, but also the chemicals that ended up down in the bottom of the catchment there, the changing climate because the body of water wasn't there, just a huge effect. And it reminds us that water has a lot of stakeholders, and we have to think about all the stakeholders of water if we're going to manage it sensibly. And so that's used to grow cotton, so it's monoculture. And it's a very serious, although it's allowed Uzbekistan economy to limp along. They're the second largest cotton exporter in the world. It's got great dangers, and in fact their economy isn't very diversified or strong at all. And so here's a picture of a picture. It's a fishing boat sitting out on the bed of the Aral Sea, about 100 kilometres away from water. And so this quite significant industry on its own has disappeared, and on top of that, the bed of the lake is quite toxic from the chemicals from the cotton industry. And so cotton was the issue, and there are other issues there that child labour is used significantly in hand harvesting cotton. The cotton is acquired by the government. There's a lot of controls as well over that particular industry. But water, misuse of water, not looking at the long-term of value of water has led to major issues in that area. And so this is just a map showing from 1960 how big the Aral Sea was. Then in 1990 it had gone green, the green bit, and in the year 2000 it had split into 2 or 3 little bits and much diminished in size due to blocking off of the rivers for irrigated agriculture. This slide is the Three Gorges. It's a model of the Three Gorges Dam in China. The water is nowhere near as clear as it's showing there. I travelled down the Yangtze River and we had a good look at the Three Gorges Dam. It's an attempt to control the water of the Yangtze for irrigation and for urban purposes as well. Huge construction, but of course we know when we put dams across rivers it potentially has big environmental effects. Certain native populations of fish can handle the stagnant water behind the dam, others can't, so you get quite big environmental changes when you build a construction like that. But it's an indication, of course it's used for hydroelectricity as well, but an indication of the pressures on China with their population, with their industrial expansion, agricultural expansion on water. And so we can expect that trade with China, that people will that China will want to import products that take a lot of water for their production, and that might open up some opportunities for countries that are very fortunate with water, like Canada, which is really amazing in the amount of fresh water that it has. Now we go to India, and going through Rajasthan a few years ago, just traditional agriculture, it's still flood irrigation. So what happens here is those 2 oxen run forward, and I'll show you the next slide, but they lift up a bag of water from the well behind, and it trips and tips into these channels, and it's flood irrigated. So there you can see the bag just coming up, but very inefficient, and of course the flood irrigation is very inefficient use of water. So we've got a lot of very traditional ways of using water, and often they waste a lot of water in countries that can't afford to do that. So let's look at just a few other countries that I visited and see what messages we can get. I guess one of the hardest pressed countries in the world regarding water is Israel. And there I saw very clever blending of grey water from towns with saline water with fresh water to produce water of sufficient quality to grow greenhouse crops. And also they've got very good at multiple reuse of water, ending up growing little fish that are salt tolerant and so on. So in some countries we really have a long way to go to get the most efficient use of water. They do a lot of desalination in Israel, but of course that is very expensive as well. Now, one of the reasons, or one of the outcomes of being short of water, is that Israel has developed some wonderful irrigation technologies that use water very efficiently. And so many countries in the world, including Australia, where I'm from, we use a lot of Israel technology to get more efficient use of the water we've had. So necessity can create a lot of things that will be useful, and some of those sort of technologies will be very important in the times ahead. I went to Iran a few years ago to learn more about Islam, but in terms of water, Iran is very short of water as well. It's a very harsh land, got big deserts, but they've got some mountain ranges where the water collects, and I'll show you a couple of slides in a minute that show how they collect the water and historically how they've used the water as effectively as they possibly can. Now, it may seem low-tech, technology and so on, but we can learn from history in countries that have had to deal with water shortages for many, many years, many centuries. We can learn some of the steps we need to take in countries that are running short of water, still have water, but need to use their water more effectively. I've been to the Gulf states where they have very, very little water, but they have a lot of money, and therefore they can afford desalination plants. But desalination, of course, is a big energy user, so you're creating other environmental problems in order to create a water supply. So if you can see this, they're called qanats in Iran, and for centuries they've picked up the water up in the mountains. They've dug a hole down into the aquifers where they could pick up the water in the aquifers. They've then very cleverly, at a slight incline, run an underground channel, and of course they have to dig this, go up every now and then and take the soil out from the channel, an underground channel that flows towards the villages and towards the agriculture. And so it flows down to a village, and they've got special tanks that under gravity collect the water and then flow through to be used in horticulture. So by keeping the water underground, the evaporation is minimal, and it's a system that can be very closely controlled. So there's a bit of history about human beings adjusting to living in a harsh land, in a dry land, and finding ways to use water as effectively as possible. And the next slide just shows what wealth can do, and some of you may have seen this in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, but they have actually built a ski field within a shopping mall in a desert, where the temperature outside can be 40 degrees centigrade or more. And it just shows around the world we're really using wealth sometimes to push the environment even harder, and that's quite a worry that wealthy people in the world are consuming so much in the way of resources, and poor people in the world often have to put pressure on the environment just to survive. So poverty itself is a huge thing that causes environmental damage. So we really have to watch the excesses of wealth and consumption and the rising middle classes and the way in which the environment is put under pressure due to that. And then on the other hand, we've got to deal with poverty, because that creates huge environmental damage as well. So that's just a little run through some of the water issues that globally we have to deal with. Let's just have a quick look now at some aspects alone of soil, because as we well know, the growth of agricultural plants, except in hydroponics, it depends on soil. We know that soil takes a long time to be created, and we know we can lose our soil through bad environmental practices very quickly. And so it is a resource that we must work away to preserve and enhance as much as we can. And yet, as I travel the globe, I see some things I would rather not see in terms of soil wastage and soil degradation. So we can go to countries like India, Romania, Iran, Africa. A lot of countries in the world have land that is used communally, commonly. When land is in the hands of a group of people who don't have to look after the land, they're just looking at how they can get value out of the land. The land is often overgrazed, badly used, nobody cares for it. And I guess many, many years ago it was called the tragedy of the commons, where the common land around villages is nobody looks after it because it isn't theirs, and yet everybody uses it, often to the detriment of the environment with that land. And so poverty in those sort of countries, again with soil, is leading to overgrazing, which is leading to soil loss, which weakens our chances to handle those future pressures of population and climate change and the demand for resource use for rich and poor people as well. In India and Pakistan, we see in countries that can ill afford to lose any soil, we see when the Ganges floods, the banks of the Ganges collapse, and a lot of beautiful soil, because some of the best soil is alluvial soil near rivers, is lost and washes out into the sea through the deltas. And floods. I flew over Pakistan, which is a country desperately short of water in normal times, but I flew over Pakistan a few years ago when virtually the whole country was flooded. And of course the colour of that water, I looked down from the plane and I was trying to work out what it was I was looking at. I thought I was looking at desert because of the colour of it. And it was the water with soil, with the red soil in it, and huge amounts of soil being washed away from a country that can ill afford to lose that soil. And I've been in Kazakhstan, where under the Soviets they opened up a whole heap of new land. They went in with the plough and the steppes, which are light soils and subject to wind erosion, and very, very delicate soils. And a lot of soil was lost through conventional methods of tillage of the soil, and not keeping a vegetation cover, and then getting wind erosion, water erosion, and the like. So a few slides to cover some of those aspects. This is a slide I took, a photo I took in Rajasthan in India, and when I was there with our family. And this woman goes out each day with those sheep and those goats, looking for the tiniest of green picks in those hills to keep the flock alive. And that happens, it's common country, again the tragedy of the commons, and so the overgrazing leads to the denuding effect that you can see there, the loss of soil, and in a country that can certainly ill afford, the productivity of that country is going backwards. And this is a slide I took in Romania, which has now joined the European Union, but the villages have common land. That's a common herd. It's not one person's herd. They've pulled them all together. But again, every day they go out onto the common country and get a pick of whatever is there, and it puts enormous pressure on that commonly held country. This is a shot in northern Kazakhstan, where it's been cultivated and therefore pretty vulnerable to any wind or water erosion. Now, thankfully, with minimum tillage, some sort of ground cover with the stubble is kept in most of that area, but still very fragile, needs very careful management. Kazakhstan is in the top 10 of grain exporters in the world, potentially important to the world grain situation. And again in Kazakhstan, alongside those huge fields where modern technology is being used, we have villages who are so poor and who really survival is what they're about, and if it costs the environment in the longer term, they have to operate in the short term, and that puts enormous pressure on. And then you come to a country that has, or an area of the world that has so much potential, and that is Africa. The Rift Valley comes down the inland in the eastern side of Africa with these wonderful soils, but so far the potential hasn't been realised for a whole heap of political and sociological reasons, and we're really going to be relying on Africa to be managed better, to realise some of its potential, get better environmental management, look after this precious resource of the areas of wonderful soils they've got. But they do have some challenges with the climate change there. In this area they normally get 2 wet seasons, but the seasons are getting more erratic, and people I've spoken to there are getting quite concerned. So a combination in Africa of droughts, which we see particularly in northern Africa and Ethiopia, those sort of countries, poverty where people have no choice but to go and put pressure on the environment, it really gives us some challenges. And a lot of the population growth in the world will be in Africa. They're saying that Nigeria will end up with a population similar to, won't end up, but will grow to and beyond, if it goes on the way it is, to a population similar to the United States of America, over 300 million people. And so birth rates are high, and we really will be depending globally on a lot of good development in Africa in order to be able to handle the increased population and look after the environment at the same time. Here's a shot I took in Morocco last year, and it just speaks for itself, doesn't it? Here are a couple of emaciated cattle with a young child that should be at school with his mother on a bit of country that is very poor. It's right on a coast, a lot of wind, a lot of salt. It could blow away, and there they are desperately trying to scratch some sort of a living in that sort of environment. And you can imagine how further backwards the environment will go, the soil will go in a situation like that under those sort of pressures. But you can't blame the people. So again, it's really an indication that poverty, we really have to work globally on poverty if we're to preserve the world's resources in reasonable shape. And just going on soil, China has massive problems to the north where it's dry, the Gobi Desert, and Beijing has been used to serious dust storms. Thankfully, there has been some quite good work done to start to halt this desertification, the expansion of the desert, but it's very expensive. But is necessary in a country like China. So any areas of the world where our deserts are expanding due to drought and due to misuse, we really have to watch. And then we go to a country like Brazil, and we're all well aware of the lungs of the world, the Amazon forest, where for short-term gain, rainforest trees are being removed for cattle grazing and for cropping, and the controls there in Brazil are not as tight as they should be. A lot of pretty well irreversible environmental damage occurring. And I've been out in the large-scale cropping areas on pretty fragile soils, and the management there will need to be very careful, using modern techniques in order to make sure they don't deplete the quality of their soil. And so thankfully down there at the bottom of that slide, technologies like minimum and no-till have been a major breakthrough in keeping vegetation cover and holding our soil, keeping the organic matter up, stopping wind erosion, and to some extent water erosion at all. Thank goodness we've had a technique like that. We have to keep working on it. Those sort of technologies, the machinery we use, the way we use it, in order to mitigate some of the negative effects of soil against the soil that I've talked about. So here we have just a couple of slides to illustrate the sort of situations that need to be looked after. Here's a cotton field in the Mato Grosso in Brazil that just goes almost to the horizon. And that's pretty flat there, but they do have quite a bit of sloping land where there's potential for water erosion. They use contour banks to a degree, but they have to be very careful as they open up new lands and take away the natural vegetation and move into this sort of monoculture. They have to be very careful that they don't lose the soil resource in the process. Can we now go on to another area, and I'm not covering all the environmental ones, but things that have hit me, and just want to talk about China here. China has a real dilemma with air pollution. You've probably seen it on news broadcasts, but I've travelled across China, and I travel by train, usually on my own, so I can talk to locals and communicate and see what's happening. And lots of young people there have told me they would prefer not to live in China while the air pollution is so bad. So the cost to the country is quite significant. I remember quite a number of years ago, on one of my first visits to China, in an English language newspaper, they'd just done a survey of the people and the bureaucrats, and they asked the question of whether economic development should be slowed down in order to look after the environment, or whether the economic development should push ahead quickly and look after the environment later. The people said they wanted to look after the environment first while development was occurring. The bureaucrats said we've got to develop first, we'll look after the environment later. The bureaucrats, of course, won, and now we're seeing the effect of this huge, and it's just awe-inspiring when you see the rapid pace of development and the pollution that goes with it. Pollution in all sorts of forms, of which air pollution is only one. So they've got the point now, if you want to have a car in Beijing, you first have to get a license plate for that car, and that's based very much on pollution and so on. Big controls coming in, but the damage has been done, and it's very hard to go back from that position, as the Chinese are finding out. But they are developing lots of renewable energy, shutting down old, inefficient coal-fired power stations, but it'll be a long road to get back to a situation that is acceptable to the population and stops lots of health problems that are occurring as well. And so this shot is taken from the top of about a 435-storey building on a normal day in Shanghai, and you can see right that east coast of China where the industry is, and also where a lot of the agriculture is. So we're getting potentially contaminated food, and as well you can see the sort of extent of the problem that country now has and has to work back from. So that was just a little bit on air pollution, and we've got problems with air pollution, of course, in many parts of the world. Excuse me. Now, I made it my business. I said at the outcome that I have deliberately gone to certain parts of the world to try and learn the long-term effects of certain things that have happened environmentally, good and bad, around the world. And so about 18 months ago, I went to the Ukraine and went to Kiev, and then spent a day north of Kiev at Chernobyl. And younger ones, it may be disappearing off their radar, but on the 26th of April 1986, there was an explosion in a reactor, a nuclear reactor at Chernobyl, and it was due to a lot of errors. They were carrying out a test they needn't have carried out. It got out of control, and they made more mistakes, and ended up with a radioactive cloud that drifted over Europe and affected the economy of a number of countries for quite some time, affected their markets. It was a real market shock. It was one of those things. And I wanted to go and see, after all these years, since 1986. What's the long-term effect of an accident, and a thing like radiation, which is very difficult because you can't see it, but it really is deadly, and has long-term effects on human health, on the quality of food, and all that sort of thing. So there I went, and went to the town of Chernobyl, and it's a ghost town. They'll only allow older people to live there, and you could just see that they've got a 30-kilometre exclusion zone around where the reactor blew up, and anyone under 18 is not allowed in. Most of it, they buried a lot of the villages because the highest level of radioactivity was in the buildings and structures, so huge efforts. Many people died trying to control and the aftermath of the explosion. They brought in 5,000 miners to dig trenches underneath the reactor because it looked as though the radiation was going to get into the huge water supplies. It's on a major river, the reactor, as are many of our nuclear power plants. So the base levels of radiation are quite low now, and that's how you can get in. But it's just like a ghost town. But also the wildlife don't know it's an exclusion zone, and they can move through the area, often getting into some hotspots for radiation, moving out again into Belarus, which is close by, the country of Belarus, and they may get shot in the forest by hunters and eaten. So the control over this radiation becomes very difficult, and there's always the threat that some of that radiation will get into a major river, major water supplies as well. And so it's a message to us. I'm not against nuclear power necessarily, but wherever we're dealing with these sorts of things that might have a long-term effect on the environment, we just have to be so careful and make sure we have political stability and we have safeguards, because once something like radiation, and we'll see it with Fukushima in Japan for a long time, once an accident happens, the effects are around for a long time. And so that's the number 4 reactor that blew up, putting this radioactive cloud over a big area of Europe. It shows we share our mistakes, and so we need some inter-country cooperation to help mitigate against these sort of problems. And they covered that in concrete. That concrete is now crumbling, and they're building the biggest movable building in the world next door. It's on wheels, and it's going to slide over the whole sarcophagus there and be all concreted in again, and hopefully will give some protection from radiation for a long time ahead. But you can see the cost of mistakes. This is being funded by the European community largely, so one country's mistake can cost a lot of other countries in many different ways. So I just sort of share that with you so we understand the longevity of some of these mistakes, like the RLC with water, here with radiation. We understand we share our mistakes, therefore we have a vested interest in cooperation and helping one another with technologies and ways of managing things. It's not to say we move ahead without these technologies, but we better know the downside and better mitigate against the downside. So I just thought I'd finish off. We see a lot, read a lot, hear a lot about renewable energy these days, and it's got significant future ahead depending on cost structures and so on. But we're burning an awful lot of coal in the world for our electricity supplies. But at the same time we're developing new technologies with renewable energy will give us a chance to mitigate against some of the effects of using fossil fuel, but still keep our energy supplies to keep our standards of living and do the things that we need to do for our economies. And so again, my visit to Israel, there's a country which at the time had not found a little bit of oil, found some oil and gas since, but when I visited Israel, virtually the only energy source they had was the sun. And it was really interesting to see how they were developing technologies to develop, to generate energy, solar, wind, and a lot of work on algae to create biomass, which create biofuels as well. And so necessity there, it is a good benchmark in the world for some of the renewable energy forms and the sort of research and how human ingenuity, properly directed, can overcome some of these problems. And of course, in the United States and many of our Western countries, there are wind turbines, there's solar energy. On our farm in Australia, we've got a 10 kilowatt solar system sitting on the roof of a farm shed, so getting better use out of that resource. And we don't pay for electricity. We're planning we'll expand it. We're on a special system at the moment that runs out at the end of 2016, by which time our system will be paid for, and then we can develop the next generation of solar panels, of battery storage and the like, and we will intend to use as much renewable energy as we economically and sensibly can. So lots to go on there, but new technologies on the way. I should have had a drone to look down and take this photo, but it was a huge area at a kibbutz down in the southern part of Israel of solar panels. And the Israelis have worked out that probably about the maximum amount of energy they can generate from solar is about 20%, because of course solar is intermittent. May be able to, or will be able to increase that with improved energy storage with batteries and so on. But there are limitations, so we'll have to use various forms of renewable energy and new technologies to be able to store that energy in order to up the percentage of our energy that we get from these renewable sort of forms. So lots of research in Israel, as I said, on algal technologies to grow algae using the heat of the sun and water, and the water they've got, even low quality water, in order to create biomass, in order to create various forms of energy. So a lot of research going on there. And this is just a shot in Illinois in the US, and it shows there are various ways of looking at this, but those particular farm owners there have income from their corn and their soybeans, and they've also got income from having wind turbines on their property. And that can help diversify as well as providing renewable energy at the same time. So can I just wind this discussion of environmental messages from around the world up with just a couple of quick comments. Really, I think it shows that we can learn a lot from other countries. Often we can get a crystal ball that shows what we should do, mistakes we shouldn't make, paths we should go down in terms of environmental management. The looking around the world reminds us that we need to take a long view. If we only take short views on environmental management, we can get into awful problems. And we need to use all our research and our thinking and our learning from mistakes and good things. We need to be positioning for profitability and sustainability. And if we go about it the right way, we'll be able to get both of those things. And so I'd leave you to say, what actions are you likely to take from these sort of messages? Because if you can take the long view, if you can get the learning going and work with your neighbours and look at the possibilities that you've got, you'll be much more sustainable yourself, and you'll lead the world to a much better place. And certainly in our case, with some grandchildren that may well be alive at the end of the century, we're working hard to try and grapple with that. It's difficult, but love to work with you to see how we can best get to the right, the best possible place. So thank you for listening to that. I hope I've stimulated a few ideas on a very complex topic, and I'd hope you'd have the opportunity to do some travelling to see some of these things for yourself that might be able to give you some insights into ways in which you might be able to move ahead environmentally. Thank you.